Hello everybody, I am Rebecca Van Herweg, and for our first video presentation I have decided to talk about Susan B. Anthony. So I kind of picked her just because with last week's discussion board, this week, we talked a lot about Barbados and how the slavery was very intense and even the natives were overpopulating the settlers population. And it kind of like sat with me and it made me want to talk about somebody who's made an influential impact to stopping to end slavery and even working towards other minorities' rights. So I have picked Susan B. Anthony. She's made like monumental changes for a lot of different minority groups, and so I decided to pick her. So to start off, Susan B. Anthony was born on February 15th, 1820. She grew up with a very politically active Quaker family that was from Massachusetts. They had a strong Quaker faith. They didn't outlaw drinking, but they had a very distaste. They had a very great distaste for it. And her father was very strict about not having any of that in their household. Following along with being this strict, he also had a distaste for any toys or games. So Susan B. Anthony didn't grow up with any of those influences in her household. But with this strong activism from her family upbringing, throughout her life, she learned to have she had like an urge to be into social reform. So let me see So she actually decided, as she was growing up with the social reform, like how she had like a lot of interest in it. A lot of it sparked when she was denied to speak, actually at one of the movements she was rallying in. And I'll talk about it later. But this is just kind of, she had a realization that because she was a woman, nobody was going to take her seriously, and unless she was a man. And so this is how she kind of got started into fighting for women's rights. And so that ultimately led to her finding the women's suffrage movement that ultimately helped create the 19th Amendment, which gave women the right to vote in 1920. So to start, I'm going to talk about the first two movements that kind of where she got her feet wet, so to say. It kind of brought her to the conclusion to fight for women's rights. So the first movement that Anthony was involved in was the temperance movement of 1848. Coming from her strong activist family, she believed in social reform. So although the Quaker religion didn't outlaw drinking or liquor, she did have this strong distaste for it. So she wanted people to have an understanding how important it was to have a stronger liquor law for families. So she wanted people to understand how drunkenness can lead to poverty and violence, and that it's caused from this overdrinking and how it can affect these families and their home lives. So while she was fighting in this temperance movement, she pushed for these women that were in these aggressive relationships to seek legal solutions to protect their families and themselves from their husbands that were suffering from alcohol abuse. So she was very passionate about this, that she was so passionate about it that she was actually elected the president of the Daughters Temperance Movement in 1853. So since she became president of this movement, she decided to speak actually at a rally and was denied because she was a woman. So after having that realization, she kind of understood that nobody was going to take her seriously unless she takes a stand for it. So this is how she began fighting for others after she was treated like this way. So she also saw that women and African Americans were oppressed they didn't have a whole lot of freedom. And she thought that they ultimately deserved to have this freedom and be taken seriously. So although she's greatly remembered for her activism in women's rights, she's also remembered for her work in the abolishment movement. and being known for one of the key reasons why slavery ended. So during her 15-year teaching career, she found time to stay active in her movements so much that she created a speech titled, "Make the Slaves a Case of Our Own." So this speech urged for an end to slavery, and she also discussed how African Americans were considered like property to these men. So she told her women listeners to consider their story as a case of their own. So by describing how both groups of minorities had no freedom and were treated very poorly, she was able to reach to these women that were looking to fight to increase their rights. This speech helped gain followers. So this speech was something that kind of helped her transition into the women's rights movement. So it gave women the opportunity to consider how they thought they were being treated and to kind of realize that they didn't have any rights and they were being oppressed. So after she founded the women's suffrage movement in 1869 and created the revolution that lobbied for women's rights, she decided to form a women's suffrage group with all these women. During this time, she found another activist that was willing to fight along with her during the journey, kind of be like a leader with her. And that woman's name is Elizabeth Cady Stanton. So just kind of, let me see. Anthony and Stanton actually created like a power duo by combining both of their skills. They were both very intellectual. Just a little bit of back history about Stanton. She was a driven, hardworking woman that graduated in 1833, and she actually married a man that was involved in the abolishment movement. So she comes from a lot of social reform, and she was very smart after graduating college. Once her and her husband moved from Boston to New York, she kind of came to this realization that women were undereducated and decided to transform women's place in society. So she understood that they needed to have this realization and want something better for themselves. So together they devoted time into writing radical women's newspapers and worked together to enhance women's rights. So they fought, they urged the creation of the New Departure premise that the 14th and 15th Amendments would guarantee all citizens have the right to vote regardless of their gender. And it also distanced the government from a pro-slavery standpoint. So they wanted to obviously work with that. So with their will to fight and their skills, they used Stanton's strong voice and then Anthony's strong will, and they created a large group of women followers that have struggled for many years, and they were willing to fight to have these rights. So Anthony Stanton and other women fought for many years to fight for women's rights, and they fought so much that it was able to pass in this women's right movement. Women were granted the right to vote in 1920. So it was a great victory for women, but unfortunately Anthony passed in 1906 and wasn't even around to see her hard work pay off. So that was a little bit unfortunate. But because Anthony was so fed up of being treated unequally, she decided to take a stand. So she disguised herself and 15 other women from the movement as a man to vote in the 1872 federal election. So after this, she wrote diaries and letters kind of concerning her actions and potential fears or consequences to some of her friends. So she actually told her fellow activist, Miss Stanton, she wrote her a letter that was dated November 5th, 1872, how she was on the run for 5 days. So she actually took a little snippet of what she wrote in this letter, and it said, "If only now all the women's suffrage women would work to this end of enforcing the existing Constitution's supremacy of national law over state law. What strides we might make this winter. But I'm awful tired. For 5 days I have been on the constant run, but to splendid purpose. So all right. I hope you voted too. Affectionately, Susan B. Anthony." And a few days after that, she decided to write another activist, Mrs. Hutchinson, who was pleased with what she accomplished. So Mrs. Hutchinson was able to persuade women to participate to vote in Connecticut. So she actually said to her in the letter, I tell them all that we mean to find out if we have law enough and enforce it, and if we have not already enough, we mean soon to get it. To vote is our will. Hastily yours, Susan B. Anthony. So from these letters, we can see how passionate she was about this and how much she cared for women's involvement to make a difference in this world. She knew that she had to take things to a whole new level, not only like rallying for this to happen, but she had to get in there and to make the difference. So after she ended up voting in the 1872 election, she was fined for this, but never paid it. So as she stood before the judge when she was being sentenced, she told them that she would not pay for their injustice, and she never did at any point in her life. So all of her strides and efforts that she made for minorities to earn like rights is just something that makes her one of the front runners that fought for equality in the early stages of America. And because of this, she continues to be one of the most memorable and admirable women in U.S. history. Through her life, Anthony fought for herself and other people to have basic rights. She was focused on minorities and being treated equally. Although she was not able to see her hard work pay off, she had many women behind her that helped continue the fight for women to have the rights to vote. In her journey, she received a lot of negative feedback and backlash, but she wouldn't take no as an answer. She wanted and wouldn't take failure as an option at all, because she believed in freedom for the people. And because of this attitude, women were granted this right in 1920. So even though she wasn't around to see this hard work pay off and to see this monumental change, she would later become one of the first women who was ever recognized for her achievements and activism, so much that she was put on the dollar coin in 1979. So because of her strong will and willingness to try, Susan B. Anthony is the reason that women have this and many other rights today. And quite frankly, I believe it's because of her that other women activists started the fight in years to come. Like, she was the reason that we decided to get started. So I think Susan B. Anthony is someone that's very important to our history because of these monumental changes she has made for not only women, but ending slavery. She's definitely somebody that needs to be remembered. Susan B. Anthony is someone who continues to be admired in U.S. history for great reasons, obviously. Not only was she a key player to fight to end slavery, but she was one of the first women who started the journey to fight for women's rights. Susan B. Anthony knew what was going on was wrong, and she knew that things needed to change in society for the better. And it takes a strong person to stand up for what they believe in, especially during this time period when she wasn't taken seriously at all. So she believed that women and slaves were allowed to have a voice, and they were oppressed and were restricted to their freedom. And that's why she stood up and did what she did. She was a hard worker, and she knew that slavery was wrong and was willing to stand up against it. She wanted equality for women and for them to be taken seriously by men. She wanted women to be able to have a voice in politics and stand up for what they believe in. She fought for us to have a right and to have a voice in elections and elections to come. So she's a person that didn't only fight for, she didn't fight for herself. I mean, she did because she was a woman, but she ultimately wanted others to have these rights. And because of her fight, she paved the way for these other women and other people to make these other strides to be where we are today and to just continue this fight for equality. So that is who I decided to write about. I learned a lot from looking up information about her. She was a very influential woman, and it's upsetting that she wasn't there to be able to see the 19th Amendment be passed in 1920. But I think she's definitely remembered, and she will always be remembered for that. And I think that it was a great time in history. So that's all I have. If anybody has any questions for me, you can always ask me. Thought this was a very interesting experience. I apologize if I talk fast. So that is it. Thank you.